No. Now, what we're going to start off today is, I believe, an equally incredible workshop. Because remember, what we're trying to do, again, is not tell you how to fill out a form and to talk about HPD and DHCR, but really to give you an analysis of what is happening here in New York City and the broader context, and to give you that analysis in a historical context. And this is an important part of it because this carefully researched book, praises from Alexander Coburn of Counterpunch, Deborah and Rod Wallace, A Plague on Your Houses. And it is really incredible. And all of us remember when the Bronx was burning. Well, why did that happen? And how is that related to what is happening today? What was the role of the RAND Corporation in public policy about planned shrinkage here in New York City? This is an incredible book. It's carefully researched, and we are very, very honored by the fact that Deborah and Rod Wallace, people whom I have known for a very long time, are here today to talk about their book within the context of gentrification and public policy. So I present to you Deborah and Rod Wallace.
The neighborhoods of color in the United States have undergone waves and waves of displacement. After World War II, the first wave then was urban renewal. And Mindy Fullilove, in her book Root Shock, reviews the national picture with respect to urban renewal. In New York City, urban renewal was an outcome of a century-long debate about slums. Property rights versus public health and welfare. Environmental influences on health versus giving you a pill. Okay. Would you please turn off your cell phones? I really can't talk when there's a lot of ringing and... That's a house phone? Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Okay. I'm so used to cell phones that, sorry about that. Okay. Back in the days of the gangs of New York, there were real slums. These were slums like your mother didn't remember. And they were a danger to themselves and to the whole population of New York City. This was where tuberculosis, typhoid, all of those kind of things would incubate and spread out to the rest of the city. Something really had to be done about them. And there was a young doctor named John Briscoe who wrote, he was the physician of the clinic down in Lower Manhattan. And he wrote the famous book, The Sanitary Conditions of the Laboring Classes of New York City. He founded the Great Reform Movement. And he did the special study on poor people's populations, which occurred after the Great Draft Riots of 1863. Okay? The notion of a slum is what took hold culturally then. When people talk about a slum, they think about those conditions. So after World War II, slum clearance became popular, and in the minds of a lot of good-hearted people, the picture of a slum was that outdated 19th century picture. By the end of World War II, the slums here were not like that. They were real communities, thriving communities, deep-rooted communities, like Harlem, the South Bronx, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brownsville. These were lively communities. Okay? Now, after World War II, a law was passed. It was the 1949 Housing Act. It had two components in it, which led to urban renewal. One of it was Title I, and the other one was Title III. And Robert Moses, who was the great urban renewalist here, used those two parts of the law to clear out communities and redevelop. Some of his projects included Lincoln Center, the UN, and Morningside Heights. I live in the Title I housing that was built in Morningside Heights. I live in Morningside Gardens. All of those areas, like Lincoln Center, Morningside Gardens, the UN, they used to be tenement housing, real communities. Title I allowed condemnation of land and the building of new private housing, subsidized by the federal government. Title III authorized the building of 810,000 public housing units. A single authority was allowed to coordinate these things. This led to an abuse in New York City because it allowed the targeting of neighborhoods of color. A disproportionate number of neighborhoods of color were condemned. Thus came the phrase, urban renewal is Negro removal. Even in integrated neighborhoods, like the West Side and Greenwich Village, the blocks that were heavily had residents of color were especially targeted. So New York City became, under urban renewal, Robert Moses' urban renewal, one of the most segregated cities in the United States. And there's a wonderful book called American Apartheid by Nancy Denton and Douglas Massey, if you want to know about the fact that New York is one of the most heavily segregated cities. But by 1961, urban renewal fell out of political favor. Even the liberals, who originally supported it because they thought it would make poor people's lives better, saw the harm that it did. These communities had been just destroyed. People were dumped into these high-rises, and the social controls that had been in effect in the old neighborhoods were lost. So, and the social support was gone. So you got the drug epidemic, you got a lot of more prostitution and violent crime because of the loss of community. So, by 1961, urban renewal could no longer be put forth in New York City. By 1964, the war on poverty began. And one of the unrecognized blessings of the war on poverty was the community organizing that occurred during it. You had the youth groups, you had the multi-service centers, the senior citizen groups, people got a lot more organized. And this was even before the civil rights movement began to look at the northern situation. You started to get black politicians being elected. So across the river, you had Kenneth Gibson in Newark. You got a black mayor in Detroit. And the white political establishment here was watching this. Herman Badillo made a credible run in 1969. He came very close to becoming a mayor. Something had to be done, and they couldn't use urban renewal. What are they going to use? What can they use to disorganize the organized communities of color? Now, before I take that on and describe to you what was done, I have to give some background on fire and fire service. Fires grow exponentially. If someone tosses a lit cigarette into a wastebasket, the first thing that happens is that fire grows slowly. That's the first phase of the fire. It grows slowly. Second phase, though, it starts to take off. It takes off really fast. So it's kind of a curve. It's not a straight line in its growth. Whoosh. Then finally, the third phase is called flashover. If you saw the movie Backdraft, you know what flashover is? That's when the combustible gases that were created by the breakdown of the combustible objects in the room suddenly all at once flare. And then you have a general involvement of the room. So it's absolutely crucial to get to the fire before flashover. It's even better if you can get to it before it goes into its rapid phase. That's why fire service, rapid, adequate fire service, is vital. Now, you see a fire. You've got to turn in an alarm. How do you turn in an alarm? Anybody? You call 911, okay? You turn it in on the telephone. There's another way you can turn it in. The fireboxes, that's right. 2 ways to turn in an alarm. It's important that you can turn that alarm in very fast. We're going to come back to that later. When the alarm is turned in, it goes to the dispatcher's office, the fire dispatchers. These are the people that ask you, where's the fire, when you turn an alarm in. They have the responsibility of assigning the fire units to actually respond to the alarm and go and put out the fire. Now, we mostly live in multiple dwelling neighborhoods. We need, as an absolute minimum, a very rapid response of 2 engines, sometimes they're called pumpers, and 2 ladder companies. That's because a fire endangers both the people on the fire floor and the people on the floor above. The smoke rises to the floor above, even if the flames don't get there. And the fire companies have to see to it that the people on the floor above are safe as well as the people on the fire floor. So, engines put water on the fire. Ladder companies, they're very busy. They do forcible entry. If the door of the building and the door of the apartment is locked, they have the hooks to get in. they also do the venting. If that fire has been going, the room that it's in might be 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and the engine guys can't go in there in that condition. The ladder guys have to do venting from above so that the hot gases are released. So you have this team that works together. If an engine arrives and there's no ladder company, they're going to stand there with the hose until the ladder comes to open the door. There's no two ways about it. They don't open the doors. Okay, now, what happened after urban renewal was no longer allowed actually began in the White House. Daniel Packard Moynihan, in January of 1970, gave Richard Nixon the famous benign neglect memo. Do some of you remember what that memo was? Right. Now, some of what he said is interesting with respect to what they wanted to do after urban renewal. And I'm going to quote here. "You are familiar with the problem of crime. Let me draw your attention to another phenomenon exactly parallel and originating in exactly the same social circumstances: fire. Unless I mistake the trends, we are heading for a genuinely serious fire problem in American cities. In New York, for example, between 1956 and 1969, the overall fire alarm rate more than tripled from 69,000 to 240,000. These alarms are concentrated in slum neighborhoods, primarily black. In 1968, one slum area had an alarm rate per square mile 13 times that of the city as a whole. In another, the number of alarms has, on average, increased 44% per year for 7 years. Many of these fires are the result of population density, but a great many more are more or less deliberately set. Thus, fires are a leading indicator of social pathology for a neighborhood. So he's labeling the poor neighborhoods as being pathological. Okay? And he's saying that these fires are set. Now, he got a lot of that data from the New York City Rand Institute. The New York City Rand Institute was set up by the Lindsay administration. It was a quasi-governmental agency with no accountability to the citizens. They had a very broad jurisdiction. They analyzed many areas. They analyzed rent control, among other things, and those step-ups that the Lindsay administration did were a result of a Rand analysis. They also analyzed fire service. They gave Moynihan his data on fire alarms. They also gave him false information that it was arson. And they paid a lot of attention to the race of the neighborhoods that had different levels of fire alarms. So they said, these high incidence neighborhoods are heavily Negro and Puerto Rican, mainly poor. Well, yes, poor neighborhoods are going to have a lot of fire. And they blamed the fires on behaviors. So there were letters that were written between Moynihan and the Rand Fire Project staff. And we saw them. We sued the fire department under the Freedom of Information Act. And we got to see all of this correspondence between the fire department, Rand, and Moynihan. So, these neighborhoods are being pictured as 19th century slums, okay? Pathological. Now, besides the Rand Institute and Moynihan, we had another character called Roger Starr. Some of you may remember Roger Starr as the author of Planned Shrinkage. Now, this is an intensification of the concept of benign neglect. Benign neglect, as Moynihan saw it, was just not listening to poor black people. You just kind of ignore them and they'll kind of go away. And you try and separate the middle-class black people from the poor black people. Okay? Roger Starr intensified the concept of neglect to something more active. It was active targeting. And planned shrinkage was a kind of triage where he also labeled these neighborhoods as sick. And he said that they were going through a natural process of aging. And they were going to die, so you might as well pull the essential services out of them. That's what planned shrinkage was, to pull essential services out of neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods. And he listed the services to pull: fire control, sanitation, mass transport, libraries. Those were the ones he mentioned. All right. Now, why did they want to clear these neighborhoods? The only thing that we were able to find as an excuse, they were thinking of having industrial zones. Now, this really doesn't make any sense because by the late 1960s, globalization was killing industry in the city. Anyway, and Bob Fitch showed how city policy was also killing industry in the city. So the idea of creating industrial zones makes no sense. But anyway, they labeled industrial zones in the South Bronx, in Brownsville, East New York, and in East Harlem. This was in the 1969 master plan. So they had a vision of clearing the land. And the master plan says thus about the South Bronx: it is an area of turbulence and change. Frequent tenement fires force residents to move and leave gutted buildings or vacant lots. Residential densities are high, averaging 85 dwelling units an acre. 4-story walk-ups on 60 by 100 foot lots house as many as 21 families. Most of the housing, grim, crowded tenements, is concentrated between 134th Street and Bruckner Boulevard. The majority of residents are black and Puerto Rican. Mobility is high. Between 1960 and 1965, 64% of the black families in the Bronx and more than 75% of the Puerto Rican families moved. Now, they neglected to say they moved within a couple of blocks. Okay? An estimated two-thirds to three-quarters of the dwelling units will be vacated over the next 5 years. This movement presents opportunities for needed industrial renewal if the city can act as change occurs. So this was the excuse of renewing industry. Now, Rand Corporation was brought in by Lindsay on advice from his unpaid scientific advisor, John Dunning. John Dunning invented a process that made the atom bomb possible. He was a key figure in the Manhattan Project. What he knew about urban systems was zilch. He knew about destroying cities. Okay? And Rand Corporation was given very broad areas for analysis, policy creation, and policy implementation. Fire service was a central area they were given. Now, parenthetically, there were other military firms that Dunning had brought into the city. His own firm, Riverside Research Institute, was one, Norelco was another, and Grumman was a third. And they all had to do with fire service, even though they were experts on destroying, not saving. Now, by 1969, Rand Institute found out that fires in New York City were a contagious phenomenon. And this is one of the hardest concepts in what I have to say, that fires are contagious. Contagion is central to the importance of adequate fire control service. With respect to building fires, under a contagious process, a large fire on a block, after a period of time, a few months, will lead to more fires on the block. We do not know why this happens, but it does happen. This is how it's contagious. If a fire is kept small, this does not happen. You know, you don't get more fires following. If you get visible fire damage, where you can see the scorch marks out the window, the boarded up windows, this kind of thing, there'll be fires on the block after a few weeks or months. Now, besides fires spreading along a single block, the contagious process, when it really starts going, will go from block to block, so that you can have a whole neighborhood involved. And the result is that if there's no adequate fire service, you get rapid, concentrated housing destruction. The only thing in the late 1960s between this kind of rapid housing destruction was the fact that we had adequate fire service. The reason why we had adequate fire service was because the fire service unions had an arbitration before the Public Employees Relations Board of New York State. And they made a workload argument that they needed fire companies opened in the poor neighborhoods because the increasing population density was leading to very high fire incidents, and their workload was getting out of hand. So you got the opening of second sections of fire companies. So you had a firehouse, and they put a second fire company in the same firehouse. So they doubled the number of fire units in certain of the neighborhoods. And there were approximately 20 of these fire units open, second fire units. When these were opened, the fire damage level stopped rising. It was stable. These were opened in 1968. Okay? So, Rand begins its policies, its fire department policies in 1969, after these companies were opened. They began by changing the responses in neighborhoods of high alarm rate. So, not every alarm in those neighborhoods would get the same number of ladders and engines. That's normal. Okay? And in a multiple dwelling neighborhood, this is a very bad idea. Their excuse was there's a lot of false alarms in these neighborhoods. So for these fireboxes, you pull the firebox, you can't expect the same number of engines and ladders in these neighborhoods. That was the first thing they did. The second thing they did, they started changing the fireboxes. Does anybody remember the old fireboxes? Where you just pull it and you wait for the engine to come and you tell them where the fire is. You stay by the firebox. You don't have to talk to the dispatcher. The dispatcher knows where the firebox is. They put in these electronic fireboxes called the Emergency Response System, ERS boxes. You push a button and you have to stay there and talk to the dispatcher. Now, nobody was trained how to use these boxes when they were put into the poor neighborhoods. So people didn't know that they're on a circuit so that if someone else has pushed a button on the same circuit, you can't talk to the dispatcher, yet you get a busy signal. Okay? It's like a party line, for heaven's sakes. So you got a lot of alarms where nobody talked to the dispatcher. Then because the dispatcher would say, "Where's the fire?" the little kids in the neighborhood, they started really pushing the buttons, and the false alarm rate skyrocketed. Rand got around this problem in the experimental neighborhoods where they put the fireboxes to see how they would do. They didn't call them false alarms. They called them diverted alarms. And so they were never labeled as false alarms. So the true nature of these boxes as a magnet for false alarms was not revealed until they were all over the Black and Latino neighborhoods. So it took longer to get an alarm sounded with these fireboxes than with the old pull boxes, under the best of circumstances. Then finally, they began to pick out fire companies to move and close. The fire department itself, independently of Rand, in 1975, also cut fire service by destaffing the companies by one firefighter each. So we have this whole array of cuts in fire service. Cuts in responses, the number of engines and ladders to some of the alarms. Increased difficulty in getting an alarm through to the dispatchers. Closing of fire companies. And destaffing of the remaining fire companies. Now, the closing of the fire companies was done in a way to shut communities up. They used mathematical models to do it. They said, what we're going to do is we're going to model response time. And we're going to make cuts so that there won't be any impact. You won't, the difference won't be measurable. They used two models. One is called the resource allocation model. The other is called the firehouse siting model. The resource allocation model found which areas should lose fire companies. And the firehouse siting model designated which companies within those areas to cut. Both of these models projected the response time of the first arriving engine. Now, okay, when you really need a team of at least 2 engines and 2 ladders, you would have thought they'd at least project the time it took to build this team. No, it's the first arriving engine. And of course, if the first arriving engine is all alone, it's going to stand there with the hose at the door. Now, the problem with these models is to predict response time, all they used was the distance between the firehouse and the firebox on which the alarm was sounded. They don't even take the fire company to the house that's on fire. It's to the box. And it's geometric distance. So all of the differences between neighborhoods, things like double parking and traffic patterns, all of these kind of things that really determine how long it takes the fire units to get through the streets, that wasn't their concern. This was pure geometry. And let me tell you, the models are extremely simple. The most complicated mathematics is a square root. Each model has only about 3 different variables in it. They are very, very simple. But because they're called mathematical models, the affected communities didn't know how to respond to these things. And every time the city was sued in court by a community that lost a fire company, the RAND people and the fire department analysts would go up and they'd say, see, this is not arbitrary and capricious. We have a scientific model. And that's how this thing has gone on and on. You remember in 2003, 6 fire companies were closed. One of them was on 125th Street, Engine 36. The same models were used. They're still using these models. Now, response time is what they call an internal measure. What most people use is called a global measure. That means things like the concentration of fire damage, the rates of fire injury and fatalities to civilians and firefighters. These are outcome measures instead of these managerial kind of measures. And when the fire companies were opened in 1968, that was based on the global measures. When they were closed, it was based on internal measure, the internal measure of response time. And of course, neighborhoods that had the highest concentration of fire companies, those were going to be the ones to lose them. And the reason why they had the highest concentration was because that's where the fires were. Now, what neighborhoods lost fire companies? I can tell you. In Manhattan, Lower East Side lost 4. The Lower West Side lost 3. Times Square lost 1. Upper West Side lost 2. Harlem lost 3. In Brooklyn, Brownsville lost 6. Bedford-Stuyvesant 2. Crown Heights 1. Greenpoint 2. Park Slope 2. Red Hook 1. Brooklyn Heights 1. The South Bronx lost 7. City Island lost 1. Flushing in Queens lost 1. Richmond Hills 1. Rockaway lost 2. In Staten Island, Stapleton lost 1, and Tottenville 1. Now, some of these were restored. Now, who got restored? This is very interesting. On the Lower West Side, 2 were restored to service Battery Park City. Okay? In Greenpoint, one was restored, and then Bloomberg closed it. In Park Slope, one was restored. In the South Bronx, one was restored, but it was turned into a squad company instead of a local engine company. A squad company services a huge area. So that neighborhood, they were being told their fire company was being restored, but they weren't being told that like 10% of it was being restored, really. Okay. City Island had its company restored. Tottenville, the rich part of Staten Island, had its company restored, but Stapleton, the poor part of Staten Island, didn't have its company restored. So of the neighborhoods that lost, there were 19 neighborhoods originally losing fire companies. 14 were mainly poor ethnic minority neighborhoods. The reopenings, there were 6 reopenings, and 4 were middle-class white. Now, by 1973, the loss of companies, the first round of companies to be cut was in 72. The loss of companies resulted in an increase in fire fatalities. Okay? There were subsequent cuts in 72, 2 rounds in 74, 1 round in 75, and then they started like whittling companies one at a time. By 1978, we noticed a pattern. Somehow, the fire deaths, as there were more and more fires, because of the contagious fires that I told you about, which were only controlled because of adequate fire service from the opened companies, soon as they cut the companies, it went to the races. And it was incredible, the number of building fires that the fire department was handling. In fact, by 1975, you began to get a phenomenon that all companies in a borough would sometimes be out fighting fires, and there'd be nothing left in case of a further alarm. They would have to bring in fires across the rivers, fire companies across the rivers, to service the central boroughs. Companies would have to come from Brooklyn to service Manhattan. Companies would have to go from Manhattan to service the Bronx during these times. So instead of having the individual little fire departments that were independent and could take care of their own neighborhoods, you had a big, bloated, strained network. And the fire department would fall behind the fires. So the fire damage, the fire deaths skyrocketed. Now, we noticed something in 1978 that was absolutely amazing. Beginning in 73, 74, 75, 76, the more fires there were, the fewer the deaths. And we looked at that, and we couldn't understand how this was happening. And what was even more wonderful was, it was a perfect straight line down. Perfect. We have a statistical measure for correlation. It was a perfect correlation. The more fires there were, the fewer the deaths. So we talked to the fire unions, and they started finding deaths that the fire department was not reporting. They were faking the fire deaths. Now, do you remember in the Pentagon Papers the description of how the Rand Corporation faked body counts in Vietnam? They were faking our body counts too. So, at that time, Charles Schumer was an assemblyman, and we turned it over to him. and he had a press conference. It was all exposed. We had the statistical analysis. The fire unions had the actual data on individual deaths that weren't reported. So that stopped that. But meanwhile, the fire companies weren't being reopened. And the fire epidemic reached a peak in 1976 because there was nothing more to burn after 1976. So it started to fall again. By the end of the epidemic, between 100 and 200,000 housing units had been destroyed. And they were concentrated because of this contagious process of concentrated destruction. They were concentrated in poor neighborhoods of color. A health area is an area designated by the health department of about 10 census tracts. And some health areas in Harlem and the South Bronx lost more than 50% of their housing units between 1970 and 1980. So this was a tremendous loss to society. And it came about because of the decision that urban renewal had to go forward, even if it had to do so by non-legal means, such as closing fire companies. Now, my colleague is going to talk about the impacts of the loss of that housing.
In perspective, going back basically over a 70-year period, every spatial concentration of people of color has been dispersed. 70 years ago, it was redlining, disinvestment by race.
Louder, please. Louder.
70 years ago, it was done by investment redlining by the government. They draw a red line around a zip code that had black people in it, and there'd be no mortgages. After World War II, you had urban renewal, as Deborah described. In the 1970s, in this city, you had planned shrinkage. More recently, we've had a renewal of planned shrinkage called Hope 6. That's where you see public housing being dynamited. That's the new urban renewal. We now have Hope 6 in New York. As Malcolm X used to say, the names have changed, but the game's the same. Now, we've gone to the next stage that has a new name. It's called gentrification. Disperse communities of color, resegregate them because this is an apartheid state. The United States is an apartheid state. Resegregate communities of color after dispersing their accumulations of social, economic, and political capital. Target them again using a new policy with a new name. Redlining, urban renewal, planned shrinkage, Hope 6. Now, we tend to play it as it lays. We play the game. We play the American game. Many of us are apartheid fundamentalists in the United States. We may believe in evolution, but we believe in apartheid. We believe that American apartheid works on its own terms, that people who are segregated are separate from the rest of us, one way or another. What happens in the white communities is separate from Harlem. What happens in Harlem is separate from the white communities. The real world, since the invention of the railroad, is much more interconnected. And this separateness is in many respects an illusion. It is a spatial separateness, but in terms of patterns of public health and public order. The paradox of American apartheid is the more you segregate, the more you become linked. I'll get into that. But outside of the American game and American style, the American style racial Taliban that believes in apartheid, we have another game. Within the United Nations, there is a growing body of international law on population displacement. And if you go to the UN Human Rights Commission website, just do a search on the term development displacement. Stuff comes up from 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I'm going to quote from a UNHCR document, 1993. The practice of forced displacement involves the involuntary removal of persons from their homes or land, directly or indirectly attributable to the state. The causes of forced evictions are very diverse. The practice can be carried out in connection with development and infrastructure projects, housing or land reclamation measures, prestigious international events, unrestrained land or housing speculation, housing renovation, urban redevelopment or city beautification initiatives, and mass relocation or resettlement programs. The practice of forced eviction shares many characteristics with related phenomena such as population transfer, internal displacement of persons, forced removals during or as a result or object of armed conflict, ethnic cleansing, mass exodus, refugee movements. Development displacement, according to a growing body of international law, is viewed as simply another form of ethnic cleansing. Harlem is being, and other communities of color in the United States, we're going from Hope 6 to gentrification. Another form of ethnic cleansing. If you take an international perspective, there is a vast body of research on the effects of ethnic cleansing, the effects of turning communities into refugee populations, the effects of turning communities into de facto refugee camps. The American system of apartheid over the last 70 years, from redlining, urban renewal, planned shrinkage, to Hope 6, and now to gentrification, involves forced displacement of communities of color, their resegregation after the loss of economic, political, and social capital. Communities of color in the United States have been relegated to permanent refugee status as a matter of continuing public policy. This violates fundamental tenets of international law and human rights. What happens in refugee camps? There's a large literature on public health and public order in refugee camps. And you would recognize it. High rates of tuberculosis, high rates of sexually transmitted diseases, high rates of substance abuse, high rates of interpersonal and intergang violence. Does this sound familiar? I live on 123rd Street and Broadway on the 16th floor in one of those developments that was done by Columbia and, to isolate itself from Harlem. And I hear the gunfire. People here live and heard that gunfire. If you look at the pattern of public health and public order in the United States, particularly in New York, in the New York metro region. Now remember, New York is Rome. This is the center of the new Roman Empire. This is the capital of the American Empire. It is linked to the rest of the empire closely by travel patterns, by what we call the probability of contact matrix. As go Harlem and the South Bronx, as go Los Angeles South Central. In many respects, so goes the nation because of that close linkage. One of the great aftermaths of war is tuberculosis. Traditionally, at the end of every war, there's been a tuberculosis epidemic. At the end of the urban burnout of the 1970s, beginning early in 1980 and through 1993, New York City had a mysterious tuberculosis outbreak. Consequence of turning large areas of the city into de facto refugee camps by public policy, these policies of ethnic cleansing. Sexually transmitted diseases. In the words of one public official who worked in the Bronx, quote, planned shrinkage shotgunned AIDS all over the Bronx, unquote. Originally in the Bronx, AIDS was confined mostly to densely packed social networks of intravenous drug abusers. Come planned shrinkage, those networks were dispersed all over the borough. The sexual partners of those infected people were the sexual partners of other people over a larger geographic area. Planned shrinkage shotgunned AIDS over the Bronx. When you do analysis of cities that devastated their ghettos, it's not just New York. New York, if you go across the country, Washington, D.C., Chicago, L.A., there is not one intact black urban neighborhood. We did a study around the cities where this process was carried out. AIDS became regionalized in the sense that it got into the daily journey, the commuting field defined by the daily journey to work, so that outlying areas became linked with the internal city's AIDS epidemic. And that only occurred around cities like New York that had engaged in planned shrinkage. Also in those cities, it has become difficult because of the shredding of social networks. This doesn't just go away. Once you do this and create a refugee camp, it stays a refugee camp for 40 or 50 years. The response to AIDS has been a drug industry response. Treat infected individuals,